Thank you. I'm going to get straight on with it. We are going to, at some point during the morning, do a test. And there's a test sheet. So if you're on the end of a row, underneath your chair or next to your chair, there's a sheet that's got the numbers 1 to 32 on it. Can you just hand those out? I'd like everybody to have one of these, please. One of these. So some people have got the secret answers. Keep all of your answers. Just the response sheet, the one with the circles on it, please. Okay, has anybody not got one? Or can anyone not got one? Okay. All right, assuming everyone's got a response sheet, so we're going to start us off. What I'm going to talk about today is some of the evidence, some of the scientific evidence, both about neuroscience and young people's outcomes, and then just thinking about some ways in which we might communicate that, some of the important principles behind it in terms of communicating that. I am a scientist and I'll talk about the science evidence, and people talk sometimes about evidence-based practice and evidence-based policy, and I don't think there's any such thing. I think you can only have evidence-informed practice and evidence-informed policy, because whenever we go to the evidence base, we apply generalizations to children that those generalizations don't apply to those children. We apply specific findings to a general population, and that doesn't apply anyway. So I think we've got to be more sophisticated, and some of those conversations that we've already had this morning about the role of practitioners in translating and interpreting the evidence, I think is important. And so I'm going to start off with that. I'm going to start off with this report from 2009, back in 2009, from the Children's Society in the UK. And in this report, so they published the report as a book, in this report they said some things that don't need evidence. They said that the idea that children are a sacred trust doesn't need evidence. You know, it's a value that we have. And that they made this point, this is a point I've learned from working with early years educators, that these children are not just future adults. You know, we get trapped in education and some things about, you know, the next steps and preparing for the next steps and those things. But, you know, what is it to be an effective 4-year-old or an effective 5-year-old or an effective 2-year-old? You know, what is it to be 2? You know, let's not forget that these kids are people in their own rights at 2 and 3 and 4 and right the way through their childhood. But where they did get to, and in fact this is interesting because I'm picking up where Keith left off, I think, when they summarised their report, they said, actually, you know, when we did this report, and we were really looking at it from a values perspective rather than a kind of what I would call an evidence perspective, what they found was that there was this theme that kept coming up time and time and time again with all of these societal issues that they were finding that were having a negative impact on childhood. And it was exactly as Keith said, it was that excessive individualism, that there's a values gap around that excessive individualism. And so when Keith talks about, you know, that brittleness of society, the blame aspects of, you know, the way that we interact with people, that affluenza, of course this was what I was thinking about when he was talking about those things. So I'm interested in that from the point of view of some research evidence. And what we started to see that around the world, people have started to pick on the importance of research evidence, of neuroscience evidence, in supporting some of those policy aspects around supporting young children to have an effective childhood.
What if you could take action to reduce crime, improve health and education levels, increase family incomes and state revenues, and improve the quality of life in communities throughout your state? Where would you begin? Science tells us that we may find the solutions to these complex social problems in early childhood, when the architecture of the brain begins to form. Brain architecture is built over time and shaped by experiences, starting in the earliest years of life. The most important experiences come from the environment of relationships that interact with each child: parents, extended family, and caregivers of all kinds. But serious adversity early in life can disrupt healthy brain development. Both brain architecture and behavior are increasingly difficult to change as individuals get older. So what happens early matters for a lifetime. Now imagine you can take action to improve the lives of children and the quality of life in this community. Where and when would that action be most effective? The links between policy, parenting, and brain architecture become much more clear when we can see how formative events and family and community environments affect child development. For example, policymakers want to make their communities safer, or improve children's learning, or reduce the cost of chronic health problems. A child raised in this environment may experience lower levels of stress and more opportunities for learning. That leads to sturdy brain architecture and a healthy stress response system, which prepare the child to achieve higher levels of literacy and other skills early in life, and later leads to improved school achievement and decreased dropout levels. Positive early experiences can also reduce levels of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Increased health and education levels can have positive effects across society, like reduced crime and increased income and tax revenues. Policies affect both individuals and communities, so making wise choices that support early brain development can improve health, behavior, and learning throughout life.
So that sort of response, that response has come from the Centre for the Developing Child at Harvard University. And what they're seeing is that the push to use the evidence can only come with a conversation about our values, a conversation about the evidence, and linking that with the policy. Lots of which we've heard about this morning, so I'm not going to labour those points. But it's that interplay and that intersection of those aspects that I think are important. And what's interesting about that as a communication tool is it's sophisticated, it's on message, but it's short and it's sharp and it's clear, and there's a clear message that comes from it. We've also got some other messages that we see from the evidence and also perhaps from what's entered into popular culture. And I'm sure that almost all of you will be familiar with Walter Mischel's Marshmallow Experiment. With his Marshmallow Experiment, either academically or from your own learning or culturally.
Okay, sit in that chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have two. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right. I'm gonna go do something and then I'll come back.
It smells yummy. Oh, it smells really good.
It's up to you. You can have it now or you can wait. Okay? I'll be back. Stay in the chair, okay? Okay.
I'm going to move on. We could watch that all morning, I'm sure. And people who are familiar with the experiment will know that this was an experiment that was published back in 1989, and what Walter Mischler did was he took these 4-year-olds and he did an experiment like that to see to what extent they could resist eating marshmallows. You know, so the 4-year-olds sat on their own with this marshmallow, and for some of the kids, you know, he walked out the door and the door hadn't even clicked shut behind him. They were stuffing a bit. Other kids could wait longer. And what he found was that when he followed up 15 years later, he went and found these kids 15 years later, that those who could resist eating the marshmallows self-reported higher levels of sociability, higher levels of self-esteem, and lower levels of frustration with their lives. He also found a correlation between their ability to resist eating marshmallows and their university entry scores. We don't need an ATAR, we need marshmallows and 4-year-olds, and that would tell us, you know, that would give us the same information about these young people. What was particularly interesting was last year he went back and found these young people again as adults, and they're the same. He did things like brain scans and things that he could do on them now, but essentially they're the same. Some of those characteristics might have diffused, but they're essentially the same. And people have used that as an argument to say, so that's the early years. You're done when you're 4. You know, you can measure this thing at 4 and you can see those impacts later on. And so a kind of neuro myth has emerged that early childhood is everything. Early childhood is crucially important. Of course it is. It's fundamentally important. And there's lots and lots of evidence about that. But it's not the only thing. And, you know, getting back to this idea of this excessive individualism, where does that get built in? Is that being built in by the time you're 4, or is that something that comes later? Or is it a bigger picture thing than that? Do we need to think about and look at the bigger picture? And if it is a bigger picture problem, where do we intervene? This is a report that came out, a book that came out, I've not put the date on, but again, it's a book that's, I think it's 2001. And it came out in the UK in response to an inquiry, a parliamentary inquiry around early childhood and the neuroscience and neuroscientific evidence around development in early childhood. It's a book that's still used and still stands up to the evidence today. And one of the things that both the report for the Parliament found, and that this is a quote from the book, was that there isn't an argument for a selective focus on the early years in education. Learning opportunities, development opportunities need to be available and need to be focused on right through young people's lives. If you have a deprived environment, that's not good for your brain, and it's never good for your brain. And the flip side of that also is that hot housing, trying to accelerate kids, doesn't work either. Pushing kids on, you know, when we get to school and we push kids on from one year level to the next year level to the next year level, that's not necessarily doing them any good. And in fact, there's a little bit of evidence suggesting that it might actually be doing them some harm. And so, excuse me. What we're finding from the neuroscience, of course, is that because of the dynamism of the brain, because of the way that the brain has got this neuroplasticity, this ability to wire and rewire, this ability to make connections. Of course, yes, during our earliest years, lots of these connections are made. And so those claims about the brain developing the most in the early years can be justified on one level, because you've gone from no connections or from fewer connections to many, many connections. But what's gone on during the rest of your life is lots of those connections have been cut away. Especially those connections who make you who you are, who change your characteristics and your personality. Those connections, some of them, have been cut away and changed. The experiences that you have in the early years, the experiences that you have in your middle years of schooling, the senior, second years, adolescence, early adulthood, right through our lives. We're constantly doing this, connecting brain cells together and breaking some brain cells. During adolescence, one of the things that we do is that we have this big burst of cutting away of many, many of those connections. One of those things where we're changing our identity during adolescence is actually through cutting connections away rather than making new connections. So absolutely, who we are is shaped by this intricate set of connections that we have in our brain. And those intricate sets of connections that we have in our brain, to a large extent, form in response to the experiences that we have. Everything that we do, everything that we see, that we hear, even our own internal thoughts can change the way our brains are wired up. And that's crucially important in the early years, and it's crucially important in all of our years beyond that point as well. And this report was something that was similar to what Walter Mischel had looked at, but what they did in this report that came out last year was they looked at 1,000 people. So instead of Walter Mischel's Marshmallow Experiment, they just did it with a few people. This is 1,000 children in Dunedin in New Zealand. And what they did was they took measurements about their levels of self-control, their ability to stop and think, to regulate their emotions to some extent. They looked at their IQ and they looked at their socioeconomic status. And they took these measurements every other year, right through childhood, into adolescence, where they started to look at things like their outcomes as adolescents in terms of smoking, dropping out of school without any qualifications, and unwanted teenage pregnancies. And then they carried on following those people right through into adulthood. And so they could see what correlations there were between what these children looked like in the early years, what they look like as teenagers, and then what they look like as adults in terms of a whole host of measures around health, wealth, and crime. They started off with 1,037 children in the study, and they carried on with 972 adults remaining in the study at the end. So they had a really sizable cohort. Excuse me. What they found was that there was no correlation, essentially no correlation, between IQ as children and their outcomes as adults. They essentially found no correlation between their socioeconomic status as children and their outcomes as adults, when you correct for their levels of self-control. Because of course what you find is that young people in low socioeconomic status environments, their levels of self-control, their ability to stop and think, those cognitive skills are not as well developed as they are in other societies. So it's not that, of course we know that socioeconomic status runs in families, but it's not inherent. It's not locked in. It's not genetic. It's not something that you're stuck with. What this is telling us is there's some cognitive capacities that are the things that are predicting what you look like as an adolescent, and then what you look like as an adult. Let me share some of the research with you. What they did was they split the group into 5 quintiles, 5 equally populated groups. And they looked at them for the children who had the lowest levels of childhood self-control, to the next group up, to the next group up, and they carried on to the highest level. And this is from the original research paper. And what they've got here, so let me just pick out the green and the blue. The green and the blue lines are measures of the green line is a measure of poor physical health. So as an adult. So as a child, if you had the lowest levels of self-control, that correlated with the poorest health outcomes as an adult. A bit better levels of stop and think, better outcomes in health. A bit better, a bit better, a bit better, and it gets better and better every time. Shift a little bit in terms of those stop and think skills, and you shift in terms of your outcomes in terms of your health. The red line is a substance dependence index. So we're seeing the same sort of correlation. Slightly better stop and think skills as a child, less substance dependence as an adult. They went on and looked at a whole host of things. I'm just going to show you a snapshot of a few. This is the adult criminal conviction rate. So in the group, the kids who had the lowest levels of self-control, 44% I think it is, 44% of them had an adult criminal conviction by the time they were 32. And it got better and better and better the more and more self-control they had as a child. Leaving school without educational qualifications, 40+% for the lowest group and around 4% for the last group. And then this is a bit of a mess, but again, it's because I took it from the original research paper. These are all the measures they took around what they call the wealth outcomes. So if we just pick a few out, the pale blue line, if you can see that, going from just below the minus 0.2 mark to above the plus 0.2 mark there, what you can see there is that's income. And the dark blue line is socioeconomic status. So what we saw was this really strong connection between your childhood ability to stop and think and your adult socioeconomic status, but not your childhood socioeconomic status per se. It was the stop and think skills that were predicting it in this study. What was particularly interesting in this study was that it wasn't like Walter Mischel. Walter Mischel's experiment, nobody helped them. Nobody intervened. And in this study, nobody intervened. Nobody purposefully intervened. But because they had so many people, what they did find was that with some children who, for whatever reason, at some point during childhood or during adolescence, shifted in terms of their stop and think skills. And when these kids shifted in terms of their stop and think skills, their outcomes as adults were predicted by where they ended up, not where they started out. So yes, the foundations are laid in those early years, and those early years are crucially important, but it's not all over. There's still the opportunity to intervene at any point. Intervene in the early years, intervene in primary school, even intervene in adolescence, and we can shift these kids and shift their outcomes. And just to kind of wrap up that story, these cognitive skills, we call them executive functions. Cognitive skills that allow you to take control of your thoughts and actions. And that's what's going on with the Marshmallow kids. Those kids, with the Marshmallow kids, what they're doing is they're inhibiting an impulse. So there's a whole host of executive functions, stop and think skills. And the core ones are these three that I've put in the middle. And that inhibiting impulse is perhaps the most important one for young children. And the Walter Mischel marshmallow story, those kids want to eat the marshmallow. They've got a really strong impulse to eat the marshmallow. But those who can hold on and not eat it, the longer they can hold on, what we see is the better their outcomes. Because if you can hold on, if you can inhibit those impulses, if you can think about every little fork in the road that you come to, I want to do this, but I know I should do that. I want to do this, but I know I should do that. Knowing you should do it and inhibiting the impulse to go down the path that you want to do in order to go down the one that you should do. Every little everyday decision that you make like that gives you the opportunity, if you go down the appropriate path, to make the most of education, to make the most of workplace opportunities, to make the most of a whole host of things that might happen to you or that you might create in your life. The second one being working memory, which is really being able to bear something in mind. So, again, at the crossroads, I want to do this, but I know I should do this. Bearing in mind that I know I should do this means that if I've got the ability to inhibit the impulse to go down that path, and thinking about that I should go down this path, bearing that stuff in mind is crucially important. One of the things that we see in teen risk-taking is they know the risks associated with their behaviours. If anything, they overestimate the risks associated with their behaviours. But what happens in the moment, in the right now, where I could do this, or I could do that, I want to do this, but I probably shouldn't, I should probably go down this. If you haven't got the ability to inhibit your impulses, and you haven't got the ability to hold in your mind all those education messages and all those things that we might have told them, it was worthless. If you haven't got the working memory capability to hold it in your mind and bear it in mind, it was almost pointless doing the education message in the first place. And I want to move us on because I'm very aware of our shortness of time. But the third one is that cognitive flexibility that for me really underpins that resilience. If things are not going my way, that I can take control and think about it in a different way, that I can respond to a change, that I can respond to an error, that I don't get locked into habitual responses that are really not working for me. And so these stop and think skills for me, one of the things that we see with are really important. I think that the Harvard group have identified them, and lots of groups have identified them around the world as being crucially important in terms of underpinning a whole host of things in terms of learning, underpinning that that excessive individualism. I want this, this is me, this is what I want, but actually maybe I shouldn't. Stop and think. It's a key cognitive skill to be able to respond to that excessive individualism. One of the things that we've seen amongst educators is when educators have been asked, where does this come from? They say, well, it just comes, doesn't it? It comes with age, it comes with brain development, it just comes with cognition, it's something that's inherited. And if kids haven't got it, it's a learning disability. And of course, kids with profound issues around their attention or their working memory, it is literally a disability. It stops them from developing abilities. But these sorts of views about where it comes from are essentially saying, work it out for yourself. are essentially saying, it's up to the kids, it'll come, and if it doesn't, we can't do anything about it. Well, I think the research is showing us more and more that we can do things about it. And I think this is a key message for our parents. That for parents, you can do something about it. The environment that you create for your child really does make a difference. And when we just did a review for DEWA, actually to inform the National Career Development Strategy, but we looked at a whole host of aspects of developing these stop and think skills. And almost every single one of them, what was in them was value, modelling and practice. And what I mean by that is that the value of the skill that was being developed was made clear to the young people. The educator or the adult in their lives was modelling that to them. And the kids were given the authentic opportunity to really practice that thing. Not drill and skill, but to authentically practice that skill. And people have put this into practice in things like, this is Adele Diamond's work from the States. And what she's done is, she supported early years educators to do a strategic shift, not to do a whole new program on top of everything else they're expected to do, but to do a strategic shift towards doing what they're already doing, but adding another layer on top of it. And so here what's going on is, the kids are buddy reading. We've got one child reading to the other child, the buddy reading. But the child on the right, she's practicing being a listener. She's holding a picture of an ear, a tangible reminder to be a listener. Look at her face. She's desperate to say something, but she's holding on to the ear. She's practicing. They're just doing what they would do otherwise, but they've added this strategic shift because they were going to develop something else alongside the same thing. I love this picture because these kids are like the village people while they're doing this, right? And what they're doing is they're doing role play. And in this role play, the kids are getting good at using their working memory, bearing in mind who they are, inhibiting the impulse to act out of character. And when they get good at this, the educator comes along and says, this has just happened. And so now that narrative that they were plodding along with, they've got a plot twist. And so they've all got to respond. They've got that cognitive flexibility. They've all got to respond to the plot twist while staying in character and all of those things. So it's doing what they're doing anyway, but just adding this extra strategic layer. I've wrote myself a little note in the corner here to compare this to practice only. One of the things that we saw in the research, in the literacy research, is that when you ask parents, how often do you read to your kids? That doesn't, in all studies, correlate with the literacy outcomes of kids. No, in fact, no, let me take that back. It never, when you ask that question, it never correlates with the literacy outcomes of kids. And that's because parents lie, So, we all know we're supposed to do it. So somebody asks us, how often are you reading? All the time, yes, every night for hours. But when you actually do something more sophisticated to measure, to get a better measure of the frequency and length at which parents are reading to their kids, in some studies, not all, but in some studies, you still don't get a very good correlation with the literacy outcomes of the kids. And what they found in those studies is that there's a better correlation between the number of children's books in the house and the literacy outcomes of the kids than there is about the frequency of reading. And in Victoria, they took that data, that evidence, and said, right, reading material in houses, that's what we've got to do. So they gave out loads of books and reading material into houses. And what impact did it have on literacy? None, not a jot. It didn't matter. Because, of course, what they'd done was they put a particular interpretation on the evidence. And they thought that the reading material in the house was causing the literacy outcomes of the kids. And in fact, it wasn't. What I think was going on is that the reading materials in the house was actually telling you about the value of literacy in that household. And it was the value of literacy that was informing how many children's books were in the house when corrected for socioeconomic status and the literacy outcomes of the kids. You can read to your kids every night, but if the kids know that, you'd rather be off watching what's on Big Brother or MasterChef or something and you really want to get away, the message that they get is, this is a low-value activity. We might be doing it, but it's a low-value activity. So the practice isn't enough. It's got to come with the value and the modelling. You've got to have, I think, you've got to have all three steps, the valuing, the modelling and the practice. Any one of them isn't enough on its own. With those stop and think skills, one of the one of the things that we've done is, well, in fact, we've used this metaphor from Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Happiness Hypothesis, and he talks about your brain being like an elephant and the rider. And what the elephant is the automatic processing, is the stuff that goes on underneath, the stuff that you don't think about, you know, and it just lets you do what you want to do. But the stop and think skills are like the rider, because it's the rider that's got in the mind the goal where we want to go. It's the rider that's got in mind that we've got to do this, and then this, and then this, and then this, the sequence of events, the planning we've got to do in order to get this outcome that we want. And it's the rider that directs the elephant. And so there's this interplay between that automatic processing and those stop and think skills of the rider, those executive functions that the rider brings. But you know, sometimes the elephant, if the elephant sees, what do elephants eat? A sticky bun or a peanut or whatever elephants eat. If an elephant sees a sticky bun over there, the elephant is going to want to go over there and eat the sticky bun. And the rider can be jumping up and down and going crazy and going mad, but really can do nothing, because the elephant, the underlying processes, some of those really strong emotional drivers are driving us towards the sticky bun in this case. And so if we think about the elephant and the rider as being like the brain and this stop and think skills and the automatic processing, as our rider gets better and better at controlling the elephant, it's not about not using our emotions. Our emotions are crucial skills in our, crucial components of our thinking, but just getting that appropriate balance right. That balance that's appropriate when you're 4, and that balance that's appropriate when you're 6, and when you're 10, and when you're 15, and when you're 42. And let me share this with you.
And Sharon's been really great with the children at going through the actual words and going through the processes and how it all works. She's much better at that than me. And I sometimes listen and I think, I wonder if the children have actually got that. And do you know, they do.
The children know now, when we're at group time, using the words executive functioning and your working memory and, you know, using your brain, so they know when they're using their brain. It doesn't come to them. And if they've done anything, you say, you know, you must have remembered what you did last time, and then you thought about that and thought what didn't work and tried something different. And using, you know, that I've noticed that with the children. And when they're building, one particular boy was building, and we talked about, you know, that trial and error, so to speak. And he came and he told me, look what I've done, and he built a 4-towered bamboo construction. And he said, I kept putting them in and it kept falling. Then I remembered that it doesn't work with that, and then tried other pieces. And you know, so he was able to come to that decision himself, or that realisation of, you know, oh, that didn't work last time, I'm going to try this.
And they end up, I think, more empowered. And they talk about controlling themselves.
And helping each other. And they use the metaphor of the elephant and the rider all the time.
In the playing outside, you often hear the language of stop and think. We actually verbally hear those words, stop and think.
A discussion at Governing Council, because I was telling the Governing Council about why we were doing executive functions. This is right back in the beginning, and the chairperson at the time went, oh, it all makes sense now. And she said, yesterday my child came home, and the older sister that's just at school came barging through the door, and this little boy put his hands on his hips and said, you know, nothing but an elephant. And she said, and I thought, how rude is that child? She said, now it all makes sense. But you see, she said he didn't yell and get cross with her and hit her. He just said,
like in the
you're
past.
just doing elephant behaviour, and he walked away. So that's part. It's going home. It's out there. It's transferring to school. We've had some discussions with our school colleagues.
What's interesting to me about that is these are obviously early childhood workers who we worked with to develop an understanding of some of these cognitive skills, and we used the metaphor of an elephant and rider with them. They chose to share that with the kids. So in terms of that translational role, they were choosing how they were going to work with the students. We didn't say, do this with the kids. They were choosing how they were working with the children with it. What was interesting about that was then that they had a shared language about cognition. They were being metacognitive. They were talking about cognition, thinking about thinking. But then what happened, which was incredibly powerful for me, was that last story where the kids went home and said, you're acting like an elephant. But now, at home, that language was starting to be adopted. And so what developed was a shared language. It was a metaphor to make it clear and not to make it too complex. But it was a strong metaphor that the kids understood, the early childhood workers understood, and the parents understood. And so they developed this shared language amongst them about why this was important and what this looks like and how to identify it and how to promote these stop and think skills. It was interesting to hear Gabrielle talk earlier about, what the things that we don't know and the impact of uncertainty. And of course, uncertainty makes everything difficult. Uncertainty, paralyzes us. Uncertainty can cause lots of stress for us. And in the neuroscience field, I think that there is lots and lots of uncertainty. I think there are lots of conflicting messages that are out there. And this is where we're going to do the test. So, what I want you to do is to get your response sheet. Has anybody not got a response sheet? Is there any spares up there that we could pass on? Yeah, everyone got one? Okay, and what I'm going to do is, I'm going to show you 32 statements, one at a time. And what I want you to do, you're only going to see them for a couple of seconds, so you're going to have to decide quick whether or not the statement is correct or incorrect. This is mean because I'm not going to give you enough time to think about it. I'm going to make you just think off the top of your heads. So, a couple of seconds, just decide whether the statement is correct or incorrect, and then we'll move on. I have no control over it. It's a video, so it's just going to go. So we're going to have to keep up. Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, let's go. Correct or incorrect? You're very tasky, weren't you? So, what I'm going to do now is, I'm going to ask the people who've got the answers to give them out, please. So if you've got a pile of answers, if I gave you one earlier, can you just put them at the end of the row so people have got sight of some of the answers? The reason why we used those 32 was that was from a study that was just published just last month about educators and some of their views around some of the neuroscience evidence. And the sheets that are coming around have got the correct answers and the incorrect answers, and they've also got a percentage on them. And the percentage is the percentage of UK educators in this study, who were surveyed in this study, who thought that incorrect answer was a correct answer. So you just get to see, what another cohort of educators thought about those things. Let's quickly just have a quick look at them. So things like the thing about the language was incorrect, and the water thing was incorrect. This idea that somehow water makes you smarter, that you really need that water. Of course, you need to be hydrated, but your brain won't shrink. There is no evidence about academic achievement for normal kids who haven't got a deficiency, and all of those are all incorrect. Your brain is still developing at secondary school. The brains of boys and girls develop at different rates, and there are different sizes. And the learning styles myth is incredibly prevalent. There is no such thing as a visual learner. There is no such thing as an auditory learner. From a neuroscience point of view, not only is there no neuroscience evidence to back that up, the neuroscience evidence is contrary to that. This idea that mental capacity is hereditary still exists in lots of policy forums, and environments that are rich in stimulus do not improve the brains of preschool children. There's even the possibility that environments that are rich in stimulus can cause problems with kids in terms of developing some of these stop and think cognitive skills. So there's a whole host of things in there, and you might have thought some were correct, you might have thought all the correct ones were correct and all the incorrect ones were incorrect. If you don't mind, I'd like to have a look at your responses. I'm not going to ask you to write your name on them or anything, but if you would leave your response sheet behind, maybe drop it at the front at lunchtime, or just leave it on your sheet and I'll collect them up. I'd like to see as a cohort where we are. But really the point that I wanted to make was, there's lots of these messages, like the Walter Mischel marshmallow message that has got into popular culture, some of the things that parents might assume, this idea about learning styles, this idea about left brain thinkers and right brain thinkers. We can see where they've come from, but the current evidence is contrary to a lot of those things. And so I think being clear with our parents about what the evidence actually does tell us and what the evidence doesn't tell us is really important. And for me, this is one of the differences between consultants and researchers that Gabrielle talked about earlier. That often the consultants are pushing a particular interpretation of sometimes outdated research. And that what the researchers can do for you is to help you keep up with that latest research in ways that sometimes consultants can't. The other aspect of uncertainty that I wanted to just finish on, I'm going to finish on this, I wanted to finish on, was this uncertainty and these mixed messages prevent our parents from making decisions, prevent our parents from moving forward. Let me just do this quick thought experiment with you. Let's imagine you've got a pack of cards, 20 cards. There's 10 red and there's 10 black. I'm going to shuffle the pack. So I've got 20 cards, and you're going to turn the top card. And you're going to bet $1,000, 1,000 of your dollars. You're going to bet $1,000 on the turn of that card. If it turns out red, you win and you get $2,000 back. If it turns up black, you lose. So you're going to choose a card from that pack, or you can choose from this pack. And the second pack has got 20 cards in it, but I'm not going to tell you how many black there are, and I'm not going to tell you how many red there are. Same deal. If you turn a red card up, you win. If you turn a black card up, you lose. That's the way I said it, the other way, yeah. So you can choose. Are you going to take the 10 and 10 pack, or are you going to take the unknown pack? Should we just do it? Hands up if you're going to do the 10 and 10 pack. All right, quite a lot. Hands up if you're going to take the unknown pack. It's still a few, more than I was expecting, but that second group was certainly in the minority. And that's what we see generally. And actually, it's interesting because by not knowing this second pack, there could be 19 black and 1 red. But actually, equally, there could be 19 red and 1 black. There could be 15 black and 5 red. No, there could be 15 red and 5 black. For every possibility, the opposite is always true. So by not knowing what the distribution of red and black is, and it's actually, from your perception point of view, the chances of pulling a red or a black out are 50-50, just like the other pack. And yet, as a group, as a cohort, we avoid the ambiguity associated with that pack. This is research coming from neuroeconomics. That pack doesn't feel right. We have an emotional response to that second pack that we don't have to the first pack. We have a much more cognitive response to the first pack. And what the researchers, these neuroeconomics researchers, found was that people prefer the known over the unknown, of course, and will sacrifice potential rewards just for the sake of surety. When ambiguity kicks in, what we get is this impulsive preference to go to certainty. And so moving forward, doing something different, when we've not reduced the ambiguity, is very difficult to do because we have this emotional response, we have this impulse to stay away from the ambiguity. So the mixed messages are really important because they create ambiguity. And so when we're communicating to our parents, one of the key aspects is to reduce that ambiguity, to make sure our messages are consistent with the evidence and are not some of those out of date or inappropriate interpretations that have perhaps been pushed upon us by others. Okay, my time's up, so I'm going to just say one last thing. Bearing these things in mind as a parent is difficult. And just like with the teenagers, we can tell and tell, we can do the education messages, we can do all those things, and the message might even stick. But it's in the moment where it really matters. It's at that point of decision where I could do this or I could do that it really matters. South Australia has been really strong on this in the area of road safety, of country road safety. South Australians might be familiar with this adults. If you come this advert that I'm going to show you, if you come from out of state, you might not be.
Hello. Every skilled kiddly knows that a caterpillar turns itself into lovely, isn't it? In a similar but less than lovely way, your can turn into something too. All they have to do is get behind the wheel of a motor car, and sometimes they turn into a total or a massive or even a complete and utter. It's called metamorphosis. But there's an easy way to stop your mate from morphing into something rather unpleasant. Observe the following reenactment. Remember, it's up to you.
The powerful thing about that road, well, there's all kinds of things there, but the powerful thing about that road safety message is that it's not to the individual. It's not to the individual to say, don't do this. It's to their mates. What it's doing is, it's getting it's getting that information into the moment of decision. It's not information back here that you have to bear in mind all the way through this to the moment of decision. It's getting that information right to that point, and that's, I think, one of probably the last key message that I wanted to give. That modelling, valuing, and practice is crucial. It's crucial for our parents to do for their children to develop some of these skills, and it's crucial for us to do with the parents as well. It's no use telling. We've got to value, model, and practice as well. We've got to reduce the ambiguity, but we've got to challenge everything. Make sure that the quality of our evidence, the quality of our message is appropriate. And then finally, we need to find ways to get our messages as close to the decision point as possible. Into communities, into peer conversations, into those discussions between parents, into the everyday conversation. Develop that shared language and get our messages and our thinking into those points of decisions, because if we do it far behind, that ability to bear in mind, that working memory, might mean that it's not actually having an impact in the moment. I need to stop. Thanks very much.